So, here to inspire us today is Reverend Glenn Stockton.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me back. Always fun to be here. I do miss being in the room with you, though. I really do.
Yeah, I know. We do too.
However, it's nice to be able to work without shoes on,
That's
Oh,
good.
God. Yeah. I want to talk today about a little bit about what's going on in our world and a little bit about just spirituality in general, how it all comes together, doesn't it? And the current events today are stirring memories of antebellum slavery here in the United States. And as horrible and inhumane as those images are, slavery in human history is not unique to that period or place, nor restricted to a matter of labor and property. The slavery I am focusing on this morning involves the ideas and beliefs that we chain ourselves to. Now, some of you may have seen on Facebook going around this week the story about the Housekeeping Monthly article from 1955. It's called The Good Wife's Guide, where they listed a variety of things that the good wife would do to maintain a happy household. And I had to read down to the bottom of the list to find the one that I really liked. I'll quote it for you here. It says, don't, when your husband comes home, the good wife, don't ask him questions about his actions or question his judgment or integrity. Remember, he is the master of the house and as such will always exercise his will with fairness and truthfulness. You have no right to question him. So I think that's time for a good laugh. there is some question regarding the authenticity of the guide's existence, but the advice it offers rings true for the time, and it's easy to believe it existed and taken to heart. It is easy to believe because we want to believe it. If you were alive in those days, or if you have memories from grandparents or parents even that were alive in those days, or if you watch Leave It to Beaver on TV or Father Knows Best, you can believe that things like this were taken to heart and actually followed by people who were trying to maintain a good household. Well, Spirit allows us freedom of choice. So wanting to believe something goes a long way toward forging the chains that bind us to what we think is true. The housewives of the time, I assure you, were not enslaved by the mythology of that time. My mother was one of them, and gentle soul that she was never less than an equal partner with her husband, my father. It was also the era that planted the seeds of the 1960s women's liberation movement. So you can imagine the extreme that we come to in the 50s that caused the backlash that became what we know today as a more modern and, I think, realistic look at how people should interact with each other. The slaves in this scenario are the publishers of such articles desperately trying to foster the illusion and maintain the facade of a control that never existed. There's a quote, I think, from Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, well-behaved women never make history. Well, that is more closer to the truth, I believe. Likewise, slave owners expended untold energy maintaining an illusion of control, fueled by fear that the truth of their paper lion would be exposed. Those in chains, meanwhile, lived every day secure in the knowledge of their natural worth. They knew they were human beings. They did not need to maintain an illusion. They knew they were intelligent. They did not need to maintain a myth. They knew the society whose labor they provided would dissolve without their participation, unlike their masters, whose disappearance from the scene would hardly be noticed, since they contributed nothing of substance to the story. The slaves of this farce slept in feather beds by warm fires, while the spiritually free suffered the abuses of tyrants throughout time, whose misguided beliefs could only be maintained by a veil of lies and hypocrisy. Thomas Troward discusses traditional religion's misguided interpretations of biblical text in his Edinburgh Lectures on Mental Science. He says, his worship, speaking of the person who worships traditionally, as we've come to know it, he says his worship is only the worship of fear and ignorance, and there is no personal interest in the matter except to escape some dreaded punishment. Such a worshiper would gladly escape from his divinity, and his worship, when analyzed, will be found to be little else than disguised hatred. This is the natural result of a worship based upon unexplained traditions instead of intelligible principles, and is the very opposite of that worship in spirit and in truth, which Jesus speaks of as the true worship. When we concern ourselves with worshiping the trappings of faith, as opposed to immersing ourselves in the teachings of faith, as we show ourselves to be faithful followers of a church simply to avoid its punishments, this is not the true worship of the God we know in spirit. Spirit, as we teach it in the science of mind, is nothing more than a creative force that relies on our freedom of choice to bring into form our daily experiences. It awaits our input and generates a perceived reality based on our belief. Spirit can only create per our direction, yet it is not the slave. We are. We are bound to our beliefs. Spirit creates whatever our beliefs dictate, but can dissolve one experience and reveal another without hesitation and without judgment. It is free. Now, this is our opportunity to be free too, because we are simply individualized expressions of spirit. Therefore, if spirit is free by its nature, so are we. But we continue to bind ourselves to a system of beliefs. That system of belief runs the entire gamut from total enslavement to total freedom. We look toward the historical characters of Jesus the Christ and Buddha and such as those who really were about as close to total freedom as you can get. We even like to think that they actually got there. And then there are those who get so uptight every time somebody colors outside the lines. These people are slaves to those lines, aren't they? And they can't be happy if we color outside the lines. And in Science of Mind, we like to start with a blank piece of paper and a box of crayons and just say, go for it. Whatever we create, we create. We suffer the illusion that our self-value is relative to the value of others. In spirit, we are all one, equal, and empowered. It is impossible to subjugate others when we accept our spiritual equality. The illusion of earthly wealth and the perceived power it generates is readily accepted in our common consciousness, enslaving us to human experiences unrelated to our spiritual truth. This illusion is our foothold in hell. The worship of money being the root of all evil, so we enslave ourselves to the belief we are victims whose generation of wealth is the only buffer open to us. Ernest Holmes writes in the Science of Mind textbook, self-pity can destroy the last vestige of happiness for anyone. It is folly for us, knowing that we are divine, to fashion chains of self-pity which keep us from coming into the full and glorious expression of life. We should pour ourselves forth in greater love whenever we begin to feel sorry for ourselves, and seek every possible avenue of expressing love, looking not to the results, but knowing all the while that love is its own healing. We are one with the eternal good of the universe and have no reason to ever feel sorry for ourselves. Spirit is a loving energy, and we are spirit. When we remember, when we approach everything and everyone with love in our hearts, our fears dissolve, our chains collapse, and we are released from our misguided beliefs. Our truth is revealed, and we enjoy the fruits readily available to us. Herman Melville's Captain Ahab had his white whale, Moby Dick, who drove him to destruction, not because the whale was inherently evil, but because the good captain could not let go of his obsession and belief that the whale was his personal enemy that needed to be destroyed at all costs. The whale was simply being a whale. The whale was doing what whales do. It was Ahab's personal conviction, his belief, his chain to a false idea that drove him to his own destruction. There's an ancient story of Plato who talks about slaves in a cave whose only vision of the world was the shadows upon the wall. And in those shadows they saw only themselves in bondage. And they thought they were bound, while all the while the chains had no reality, but they had no concept and could not even believe what was happening in the outer world when one was finally allowed to escape the cave and see what was really going on in the daylight. Katie Byron writes in Who Would You Be Without Your Story? Claims that another person is never your boss. That leaves only you to be your boss. A boss you'll always want to say yes to. We think of the slaves, or any slaves, as being people who have no choice in what they do. And physically, this is often the case. However, they always have a choice, and we always have a choice in what we think and what we believe. We can live our lives bound to false beliefs and think of ourselves as victims, or we can unchain ourselves from those false beliefs and know that regardless of what's happening in the world around us, what circumstances are seemingly forcing us to do, that we are in fact spiritual beings. We are creative beings. We are loving children of this eternal loving power. We have the power to express love in every opportunity. We can express that love even to those who seem to be imprisoning us. We may feel that we are victims of the politics of our time, of our employment opportunities, of where we live, but that doesn't stop us from looking at our neighbor or the person approaching us on the street and saying to ourselves, there's another expression of spirit. There's another expression of joy that I can celebrate and be a part of a joyous, beautiful experience today. So I invite you to simply join me in becoming spiritually self-employed. Shackle yourself to joy and love. The benefits are generous and the hours are great. So thank you.